You probably saw the headline and thought this was just another skirmish in the endless tariff wars. Another noisy trade dispute. Another episode of political posturing that would dominate cable news for a few days and then quietly fade away. On the surface, it looked familiar, predictable even. But what happened here runs far deeper than tariffs. And once you see it clearly, it fundamentally changes how you understand power, dependence, and vulnerability in the modern global economy. Because this story is not really about trade policy, it is about food, it is about farmers, and it is about a mineral most people never think about, yet one that quietly underpins the stability of entire nations. Officially, the move was framed as part of a broader effort to pressure foreign suppliers and protect domestic industries. The Trump administration announced higher tariffs on a range of imports, including potash coming from Canada. The political message was familiar and emotionally charged. Protect American producers. Reduce reliance on foreign inputs. Put America first. In speeches, this language sounds strong. It sounds decisive. On paper, it looks like leverage. But agriculture does not operate on rhetoric. Potash is potassium chloride. It is one of the three essential nutrients required for modern farming, alongside nitrogen and phosphorus. Without it, crops do not simply grow a little slower. Their entire biological structure weakens. Root systems shrink. Plants become more vulnerable to drought and disease. Yields decline sharply. Farmers often refer to potash as the silent backbone of agriculture because when it is present, nothing dramatic happens. Fields look normal. Harvests arrive on schedule. But when it is disrupted, failure spreads quietly and relentlessly. This is not theoretical. It is agronomy. Corn, soybeans, wheat, rice, vegetables. Nearly every major food crop grown in the United States depends on potash. And here is the part that exposes the gap between political theater and economic reality. The United States does not produce enough potash to meet its own needs. Not even close. Domestic mines cover only a small fraction of annual demand. More than 80% of the potash used by American farmers comes from Canada, overwhelmingly from Saskatchewan, which sits on one of the largest, richest, and most accessible potash reserves on Earth. This is not a marginal trade relationship. It is a structural dependency. So when tariffs are imposed on Canadian potash, they do not protect American farmers. They tax them. The cost does not vanish into the abstract. It flows directly into higher fertilizer prices, higher operating expenses, and thinner margins for farmers who already operate on razor-thin returns. Fertilizer can represent more than a third of a farm's annual costs. Potash is not optional. Farmers cannot simply skip an application cycle or switch suppliers overnight without risking their entire harvest. This is where the policy stops being theoretical and becomes deeply human. Picture a family farm in the Midwest. Thousands of acres planted with corn or soybeans, already dealing with volatile weather patterns, unpredictable export prices, and debt payments that do not pause when markets turn against them. A sudden spike in fertilizer costs can be the difference between breaking even and losing the farm. When tariffs push those costs higher overnight, the damage does not appear in government press releases. It shows up at kitchen tables, intense conversations with lenders, and eventually in foreclosure filings. Economists warned early that tariffs on potash would ripple quickly through the agricultural economy. They were not guessing. They were following basic arithmetic. Higher input costs reduce competitiveness. Reduced competitiveness leads to lost export markets. Lost export markets create surplus crops and falling prices. That is how you end up with grain bins full and balance sheets empty at the same time. If you have been wondering why farm bankruptcies have continued to rise despite strong harvests in some regions, this is a major part of the explanation. Productivity alone does not save farms when the cost structure collapses. And while American farmers are absorbing this pressure, Canada finds itself in a very different position. Canada is not scrambling. Canada is fielding calls. Because when a country controls a resource that feeds millions, and when it supplies that resource reliably year after year, it does not need to react to tariffs with panic. It waits. And in the global economy, waiting from a position of indispensability is power. While American farmers were absorbing higher costs quietly and painfully, something very different was happening beyond U.S. borders. The global potash market did not freeze. It did not wait for Washington to recalibrate its strategy. It adjusted, calmly and efficiently, the way markets always do when essential resources are involved. Canada, as the world's largest potash producer, did not need to retaliate with dramatic announcements or confrontational speeches. Its leverage already existed, embedded in supply chains that modern agriculture cannot function without. Countries that rely heavily on imported fertilizer understood this immediately. Brazil, China, India, and several Southeast Asian nations were already concerned about long-term food security in an era of climate volatility, population growth, and geopolitical fragmentation. For them, stable access to potash is not a commercial preference. It is a strategic necessity. And Canada is uniquely positioned in that equation. Saskatchewan alone accounts for a dominant share of global potash exports. The mines are large, modern, politically stable, and supported by infrastructure built over decades. When uncertainty enters the U.S.-Canada trade relationship, Canadian producers do not face a shortage of buyers. They face an opportunity to diversify risk. That distinction matters. In global markets, diversification is not a punishment tool. It is insurance. This is where the deeper shift begins. As tariffs raised costs for American buyers, Canadian producers accelerated discussions elsewhere. Long-term supply agreements began taking shape. Not spot purchases, not short-term trades, but multi-year contracts designed to lock in volume and price stability. For countries like Brazil, whose agricultural sector feeds hundreds of millions and drives export earnings, securing fertilizer supply is a national priority. For China, which has experienced food price shocks and supply disruptions in the past, reducing exposure to uncertainty is a core policy objective. Once those agreements are signed, they do not unwind easily. Potash mining is capital-intensive. Production planning happens years in advance. Shipping routes are optimized. Ports expand. Rail networks adjust. Financial markets price in new expectations. When supply flows are redirected, they create new gravitational centers in the global economy. And those centers do not shift back simply because political tensions cool. This is the part of trade wars that rarely makes headlines. They do not just impose temporary costs. They reshape habits. They teach countries who they can rely on when pressure rises. And once that lesson is learned, it tends to stick. For American agriculture, this creates a dangerous asymmetry. Farmers cannot easily replace Canadian potash. Russia and Belarus together hold significant reserves, but sanctions, conflict, and political instability make them unreliable suppliers. Betting food security on unstable regions is not a strategy. It is a gamble, and it is one American farmers never voted to take. The anxiety this creates in rural America is not theoretical. Farmers understand risk better than most. They hedge against weather. They manage price volatility. What they struggle with is policy-driven uncertainty they cannot plan around. When fertilizer prices swing because of decisions made hundreds of miles away, trust erodes, not just in markets, but in institutions meant to provide stability. And trust, once damaged, is expensive to rebuild. At the same time, global buyers are watching closely. They are not emotional about this, they are pragmatic. They see which countries treat essential inputs as bargaining chips and which treat them as long-term commitments. Reliability becomes a competitive advantage. Countries that demonstrate it attract capital, contracts, and influence. Countries that do not pay a premium to compensate for risk. Canada understands this dynamic well. Rather than escalating rhetoric, Ottawa has focused on reinforcing its reputation as a dependable supplier. This is not about punishing anyone. It is about reducing vulnerability. Relying too heavily on a single market that can become hostile overnight is not prudent economic policy. By broadening its customer base, Canada strengthens its own security while quietly increasing its leverage. And this is where the balance of power subtly shifts. For decades, U.S. policymakers operated under the assumption that access to the American market was the ultimate prize, that allies would tolerate pressure because the alternative was worse. In many sectors, that assumption held, but global demand has grown. Alternative markets are larger, wealthier, and more interconnected than ever before. When those markets offer stability, leverage weakens. Potash is a textbook example. It exposes the limits of using tariffs against structurally indispensable suppliers. It reveals how quickly economic pressure can invert. And it demonstrates that in a world where food security is increasingly tied to national stability, resources like fertilizer carry strategic weight comparable to oil or gas. This is no longer a bilateral dispute. It is a signal. And in the final part, we will examine what happens when farmers, voters, and governments begin to fully grasp that essential systems cannot be weaponized without consequences, and how this moment may permanently alter how trade power is understood in the modern world. What makes this moment so consequential is not just the economic damage already done, but the realization that something fundamental has shifted beneath the surface. This potash dispute is exposing a flaw in how power is understood in the modern global economy. For decades, policymakers operated under the belief that size alone guaranteed control, that the largest market could dictate terms, absorb friction, and force compliance. But essential systems do not bend to narrative. They bend to physical reality. Food does not negotiate. Crops do not respond to pressure campaigns. They respond to nutrients, soil chemistry, water, and timing. And when one of those inputs becomes uncertain, the entire system destabilizes. That is why potash matters far beyond agriculture. It sits at the intersection of food security, economic confidence, and political legitimacy. When governments interfere with that intersection without fully understanding the consequences, the backlash does not arrive all at once. It spreads quietly, season by season. This is where the limits of emergency responses become clear. As pressure from farmers intensifies, the instinct in Washington is familiar. Announce relief packages, expand subsidies, frame financial aid as proof of solidarity with rural America. And in the short term, that money does help keep farms afloat. Loans get serviced, operations continue. But subsidies do not restore predictability. They do not lower fertilizer prices. They do not rebuild trust in supply chains. They treat symptoms while leaving the underlying problem intact. And over time, that creates a dangerous feedback loop. Markets begin to price in political risk. Suppliers demand higher premiums. Farmers delay investment. Younger generations hesitate to enter an industry where input costs can swing wildly based on policy choices beyond their control. Consolidation accelerates. Small and medium-sized farms disappear. Rural communities hollow out. These changes are slow, but they are structural. And once they take hold, reversing them becomes extraordinarily difficult. Meanwhile, the global response continues without pause. Brazil secures long-term contracts. China locks in supply agreements. Other agricultural powers do the same. These are not opportunistic trades. They are strategic moves designed to reduce exposure to volatility. Once those contracts are signed, Canadian producers plan around them. Infrastructure expands to support new flows. Rail networks, ports, and shipping routes adapt. Capital follows certainty, and the global potash map redraws itself quietly, without fanfare. This is how trade wars leave lasting scars, not through dramatic collapses, but through gradual rewiring. Relationships shift, habits form, trust relocates. And when tensions eventually ease, the old patterns do not automatically return. Markets remember who was reliable when it mattered. For American farmers, this realization is deeply unsettling. They are not ideological actors. They are pragmatic. They want stable access to inputs, predictable pricing, and confidence that planting decisions made today will still make sense at harvest. When trade policy undermines those assumptions, frustration turns into disengagement. Farm organizations that once avoided trade debates now speak openly. not to score political points, but to demand predictability. This is where democratic accountability enters the picture. Trade policy often unfolds far from the people most affected by it. But when decisions translate directly into higher costs, lost competitiveness, and financial stress, the distance collapses. Kitchen table economics becomes national policy. And when people feel sacrificed for symbolic victories, trust erodes not just in markets, but in institutions themselves. Canada's approach offers a revealing contrast. Rather than treating disruption as leverage, Ottawa has treated stability as an asset. By supporting farmers through income stabilization programs, encouraging diversification, and avoiding dramatic retaliation, it has reduced volatility instead of amplifying it. That does not eliminate risk, but it makes it manageable. It sends a signal to global partners that commitments will be honored even when politics get tense. That signal carries weight. In the modern world, power is increasingly quiet. It is exercised not through threats, but through reliability. Countries that deliver consistently become indispensable. Countries that politicize essential inputs become risky partners. Over time, capital, contracts, and influence flow toward stability. And this is the uncomfortable truth this episode reveals. The assumption that allies will always absorb pressure because access to the U.S. market is irreplaceable is no longer guaranteed. Alternative markets exist. Demand is global. And when those alternatives prove dependable, leverage weakens. Potash has simply made that reality impossible to ignore. Looking ahead, the consequences will not resolve themselves quickly, even if tariffs are adjusted, even if rhetoric softens, even if emergency aid flows. The lesson has already been learned by global buyers. Supply chains have begun to adapt. Trust has begun to shift. And rebuilding it will require more than announcements. It will require sustained policy consistency over years. This is why this moment matters. It is not just about fertilizer. It is about whether essential systems can be weaponized without consequence. It is about whether short-term political wins are worth long-term structural damage. And it is about whether modern trade policy understands the difference between leverage and dependency. Because when you treat a silent backbone like potash as a bargaining chip, you discover something uncomfortable. The system does not break loudly, it adjusts quietly. And by the time the adjustment becomes visible, the balance of power has already moved. That is the real story here.